Hello, everybody. This is a GED report that's going to hit close to home. Let me close up the studio windows real quick because it gets a little noisy here in the Bronx. So I got to tighten up the studio. Your money doesn't go to waste. Only the best for my legions of fans. No sunglasses this time either. You get to see my real face. My legions of fans appreciate that one a lot. Get to see me in the flesh. No sunglasses, no shroud, no nothing. But this video cast is because this is the 100th anniversary of my grandmother's birth. It's actually technically it's 100 years and 2 days. But my grandmother, my mother's mother, was born on June 1st, 1919. 100 years practically to the day, 100 years ago. And one of the things that I've talked to you guys about a lot is the real America versus the fake America. And I drive people crazy all the time. My wife, my 10-year-old, my mother, most of my colleagues, people I know on the street, my barber, the guy I work out. Okay, you get the point. But I drive a lot of people batty with my fake America cracks because there was the real America and there's the fake America. And my grandmother was born on June 1st, 1919, and that was the real America. It had been hit with the first of two big hits that destroyed the country. The first one was a smaller hit. It was the Spanish-American War in the late 1800s, 1898. And that was the first salvo of what today we call globalists. Why the United States needed to be down in Cuba to protect, get involved in, deal with, have any handle in, or any business in, I said business, maybe I should have used a different word, but any business down in this battle between the Cubans and the Spanish. Well, there was some business involved, if you look at that. And you also have the false flag attack that is remember the Maine. And you learn in school that remember the Maine is one of those things where, well, if you got to remember those pesky terrorists blowing up that ship and we got to go down there and fight. Well, that's a familiar pattern and a familiar recipe. Anyone over the age of 8 with an IQ over 85 can pretty much draw a pattern to that one. Remember the Maine, 1898. We've got to go down there and just set things right. And that was the globalists for the first time looking up from the trough and saying, hey, wow, there's an entire real country here to exploit. The second thing is that my grandmother born into, the only two things really that I can, hold on. I mean, the main two things is the founding of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve was the first big body blow to a free and reasonably capable, reasonably coherent, somewhat genuine experiment in freedom in what was called these United States. And the Federal Reserve, Charles Lindbergh, a bunch of other people in government were brutally against the Fed because they knew that it was outside interests taking over the currency and the finances of the United States. There already was a Treasury Department. There already were Treasury notes. The system wasn't broken and it didn't need to be fixed, but nefarious globalist people who just can't seem to get enough had to found the Federal Reserve, and the people who were against it were exceedingly well-spoken. They were right. The American people at the time understood money. They knew what the gold standard was all about. They understood what the power of gold was, and they knew that in a free market laissez-faire system, while it has trade-offs of all the other systems, it was the best one. This was all going on in the early 1900s. And my grandma, born June 1st, 1919, it was Spanish-American War and the Fed were the only two things that were really the trouble. World War I, of course, a huge, crushing blow to Western civilization. The thing is, the Federal Reserve made World War I possible. The only way to swing World War I is having a Fed there to create money, to create credit, to play games with those kinds of things in order to finance war. You can't have big wars, and they got to be paid for somehow. And unless you have the head of the snake creating money, creating credit, creating debt serfdom for everybody else, you can't do a big war like that. And between 10 and 20% of the people, actually, let me say it differently, 80 to 90% of the United States electorate was against going into World War I because that was Europe's war. Why would the United States need to be in it? Everybody knew that Adams had said, let's not go overseas in search of monsters to slay. They knew their American history. School hadn't been corrupted to the point where that Americans didn't know anything. And this was the world into which my grandmother was born. A real country. It had those two things. The Fed was a cancer. It was growing. You had the globalists and the large heads of bank with their eyes apparently on the wealth and riches of the United States, but they hadn't sunk their claws into it yet. You had the ending of slavery in 1865 and the incredible, and you could look up, and you should look up the numbers, the incredible explosion of and rising up of the black population of the United States. The literacy numbers of freed slaves from 1865 to 1880s, 1890s is completely unheard of, in the sense that the black population was just a powerhouse when it came to being able to take itself and better itself without any welfare, without unions, without public sector unions, without the Great Society, without Social Security, without an income tax. None of those things were in place. And you have an enslaved people becoming part and parcel of American society. I know it wasn't perfect. Please don't give me a speech. It's Sunday. I don't need a sermon. I know it wasn't perfect. Stop looking for utopia. That's part of your problem. Well, it wasn't perfect. Look at all these other things that are going, yeah. You mean like now when it is perfect? Don't be stupid, please. See how you get me upset? Anyway, June 1st, 1919, the income tax had been started as well. That was a rough one. But World War I had to be started with a massive amount of propaganda. You had people standing up in movie theaters, barking out war propaganda, going after the Hun. The income tax had to be approved in a dark shroud of weirdness. Look at how some of the states, quote unquote, ratified the income tax amendment. The story stinks. And if you look into it deeply, you're going to go down some rabbit holes. The income tax, there are people who say that it was done fraudulently, and they have a case. I think it was Kentucky and how it was, quote unquote, ratified, where it didn't seem to really have been ratified at all. So you have those kinds of things going on with the income tax and World War I. And the Federal Reserve, I mean, you had that meeting in Jekyll Island in complete secret. Nobody spoke about it for about 20 years. And even then, the only comment was in a book somewhere, in a little blurb in a newspaper article. The Federal Reserve had to be totally done in secret. The Aldrich Act got defeated because of Senator Aldrich's name on it. People and their representatives said, no, we're not going to have organized wealth take over the finances of the United States. You've got to be kidding me. That's not going to happen. And it went down. Think of any major banking act in the last 40 years that's been defeated. They never get defeated because, well, the banks run the United States and the Federal Reserve controls everything. But back then it was. June 1st, 1919, when my grandmother was born, real things would happen. The American public figured a lot of things out on its own. Charles Lindbergh, the aviator's father, a politician up in Minnesota, everything he said about the Federal Reserve came true. Everything. He spoke eloquently against the Fed. There were newspaper editorials against it. People recognized organized wealth and said, that's not how we do it here in the United States. This is the land of the free, home of the brave. We don't need a puppet master. We don't need the things that you're saying. A gold standard, while it has trade-offs, it works. And that was, to wrap this up, the America of then, the real America. It was on a gold standard. There were no unions to speak of. It had become, the United States, an economic powerhouse. The United States had gone from a backwater along the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, basically under the thumb of the British, kind of scared of the major powers of the day, to a country that, if it had not been asked to go into World War I, the British and the French would have lost. Let me say that again. Right? My grandmother born June 1st, 1919. The United States had become everything. And it didn't have any of the nonsense. It had a gold standard, no income tax, freedom, and it had become the country that had the whip hand. Britain and France basically got J.P. Morgan to go to the United States, take it over to some degree, and say, look, we need the United States in this war, otherwise we're going to lose. And that's what they did. So they did the propaganda job of a lifetime. And they got the United States into World War I. It took that kind of power to move the American people. And that's the country into which my grandmother was born. Unfortunately, that country doesn't exist anymore. And that's why I call it the fake America. I'll talk to you next time.